So I've been wanting to do this for a while. And this is what I've been wanting to do for a while is um, I know it's probably available, but start a free learn for life sort of series. And I guess this is how we're starting it. By a version of an audiobook by someone who's not a professional by any means, just someone who is a really big fan of the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And there are obviously a lot of contents to the book. I'll try not to edit anything out and try and make it as real as possible, but I unfortunately am a lot of times a perfectionist, which takes its toll on everything. Okay, so a guide to spiritual enlightenment. I'm gonna go straight into the introduction and the origin of this book, and I'll start reading. Hope the audio quality is good enough. I have little use for the past and rarely think about it. However, I would briefly like to tell you how I came to be a spiritual teacher and how this book came into existence. Until my 30th year, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. It feels now as if I am talking about some past lifetime or somebody else's life. One night, not long after my 29th birthday, I woke up in the early hours with a feeling of absolute dread. I had woken up with such a feeling many times before, but this time it was more intense than it had ever been. The silence of the night, the vague outlines of the furniture in the dark room, the distant noise of a passing train, everything felt so alien, so hostile, and so utterly meaningless that it created in me a deep loathing of the world. The most loathsome thing of all, however, was my own existence. What was the point in continuing to live with this burden of misery? Why carry on with this continuous struggle? I could feel that a deep longing for annihilation, for non-existence, was now becoming much stronger than the instinctive desire to continue to live. I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my mind. Then suddenly I became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me. The T and the self that T cannot live with. Maybe, I thought, only one of them is real. I was so stunned by this strange realization that my mind stopped. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. Then I felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first and then accelerated. I was gripped by an intense fear and my body started to shake. I heard the words resist nothing as if spoken inside my chest. I could feel myself being sucked into a void. It felt as if the void was inside myself rather than outside. Suddenly, there was no more fear, and I let myself fall into that void. I have no recollection of what happened after that. I was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside the window. I had never heard such a sound before. My eyes were still closed, and I saw the image of a precious diamond. Yes, if a diamond could make a sound, this is what it would be like. I opened my eyes. The first light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. Without any thought, I knew that there is infinitely more to light than we realize. That soft luminosity filtering through the curtains was love itself. Tears came into my eyes. I got up and walked around the room. I recognized the room, and yet I knew that I had never truly seen it before. Everything was fresh and pristine, as if it had just come into existence. I picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. That day, I walked around the city in utter amazement at the miracle of life on earth, as if I had just been born into this world. For the next 5 months, I lived in a state of uninterrupted, deep peace and bliss. After that, it diminished somewhat in intensity, or perhaps it just seemed to because it became my natural state. I could still function in the world, although I realized that nothing I ever did could possibly add anything to what I already had. I knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to me, but I didn't understand it at all. It wasn't until several years later, after I had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that I realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to me. I understood that the intense pressure of suffering that night must have forced my consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind. This withdrawal must have been so complete that this false suffering self immediately collapsed, just as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy. What was left then was my true nature as the ever-present I am. Consciousness in its pure state prior to identification with form. Later, I also learned to go into that inner, timeless, and deathless realm that I had originally perceived as a void and remain fully conscious. I dwelt in states of such indescribable bliss and sacredness that even the original experience I just described pales in comparison. A time came when, for a while, I was left with nothing on the physical plane. I had no relationships, no job, no home, no socially defined identity. I spent almost 2 years sitting on park benches in a state of the most intense joy. But even the most beautiful experiences come and go. More fundamental, perhaps, than any experience is the undercurrent of peace that has never left me since then. Sometimes it is very strong, almost palpable, and others can feel it too. At other times, it is somewhere in the background, like a distant melody. Later, people would occasionally come up to me and say, "I want what you have. Can you give it to me or show me how to get it?" And I would say, "You have it already. You just can't feel it because your mind is making too much noise." The answer later grew into the book that you are holding in your hands. Before I knew it, I had an external identity again. I had become a spiritual teacher. Before moving into, I guess, the next section of the introduction, I would like to make a disclaimer that I am someone who has always been on some sort of a spiritual journey. I was a so-called born Muslim. And then I felt like I had to find Islam for myself, because the way it was taught to me, just like any other religion and any other, way of teaching, a lot of times people diminish and dismiss and destroy what they teach by the way they teach it. So I had to find Islam for myself again, and that was around the ages of 17 and 18, in case anyone was wondering, and it was really tough. I thought at the time that it was some sort of a midlife crisis, only to realize later that obviously I wasn't even midway through anything yet. That was because of a lot of factors, and the main one at the time was that My parents, which are great people, by the way, alhamdulillah, thank God, um, have their own mistakes and have their own faults, and they have sort of taught us that unintentionally and sometimes intentionally. Sometimes people get too strict or too loose with religion, and I'm talking here strictly about people who would like to find religion for themselves and who have born into a certain family that practices religion, or a household that has religion as a core value to go back to as an objective sort of judgmental like line or base or rule or whatever. So in saying all of that, I do recognize, to me at least, that religion is a very important thing. It gives purpose, and it gives hope, and it gives faith, and all these beautiful, beautiful things. But at the same time, it could a lot of times be too strict, and that is again by the people. Sort of like when I think of religion, I mainly personally think of the three Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Because as a Muslim, I believe that they were all sent by the same God. We as Muslims call that God Allah, and Arab Christians and Jews as well do call that God Allah. There is no reason I'm making this disclaimer other than the fact that I want to make it. Just like before any funny ideas come to anyone else's heads, because I've never uploaded anything so publicly, and I plan on uploading this on YouTube. So anyway, I'll one second. Yeah, so at the time, the issues that I was facing at 17 and 18, that probably were the main factor in triggering this idea of what is God? Why is it that I'm taught to pray 5 times a day? Why is it that I'm taught to fast for 1 month? Ramadan for Muslims. Oh my God, you don't even drink water? Yeah, we don't drink water. From like, I think, is it 1 second? I know the terms in Arabic. I do forget them quite often in English, so 1 second. So I'll just read this off from Google. Fasting generally entails abstaining from food, drink, and sexual relations from before the first light of dawn until the setting of the sun. Muslims are required to fast on each of the 29 to 30 days of Ramadan. If unable to fast, charity or fasting days outside Ramadan may suffice. In saying that, it is really important to make it clear and obvious that some people are not privileged enough, for the lack of a better term to use in this context, to be able to fast. In this case, the privilege, or the so-called privilege, is health. I have family members that are diabetic, and obviously that's where the ruling falls. That's where it is in Islam allowed to not fast anymore. And it's actually, in this case, it would be haram, or it would be a sin to fast, because you're harming yourself, and by extension, harming your ability to worship God, which we do believe that that is the purpose of life, basically, that is why God has put us on his earth to worship him. And worship does not necessarily mean prayer. It does mean prayer, but that's a very limited definition of worship. Worship comes in many forms, and all of that. So you can pray, fast, you can basically, in Islam, we have a concept called remembrance of Allah, which in Arabic we call dhikr. Remembrance of Allah is basically literally just remembering Him and looking around and, appreciating all the things that He has created, including yourself. And as Muslims, our, that is where our self-love, quote unquote, comes from, and self-worth, etc. But as Muslims, and this is a general statement, but it is a true statement, that we usually think of ourselves as a part of a community. So it doesn't have to be any sort of community. We just usually think in a collective manner. Some people see that as a negative. Some people see it as a positive. I see it as both. But I think it is a very understanding and empathetic approach to life. And by being God conscious and having taqwa of Allah, we think that, and we know and we believe that every action in the world has a reaction. So, for example, we understand that, and I'm just going to give this example because it's very widespread all over the globe. Drinking and smoking and clubbing and all of the stuff that, as a youth in general, all of us fall into it at one point or another. And that we, Muslims at least, believe that كل بني آدم خطاء, or every son of Adam, aka every human being, is a sinner. So basically, I'm not trying to make this too long or anything. I hope it's not too long. It's been 17 minutes already. Yeah. So I'm gonna share a few verses, which are some of my favorite verses, and I hope that helps somebody out there who decides to click on this. Okay, maybe we should start with a reflective tip, a Quranic reflective tip. Now, in case anyone doesn't know, the Quran is the book of Allah that was revealed to Muslims. We believe that. Whoever wants to hate can hate. And acting according to the orders of the Quran without hesitation, that's a reflective tip right there. And the other one is learning the tafsir of the Quran, because the Quran is only 600 and something pages. On top of my head, I honestly cannot remember 600 and how many pages. Astaghfirullah. Anyway, but it is a very small book compared to other books, like the Bible, for example, has so many stories and so many different books and so many different, all of that. So it is easy to think that the Quran is less detailed or would allow for less self-reflection, since it has, like, literally speaking, a few number of stories. I don't see it that way. I think, Muslims generally, the good ones, okay, quote unquote, don't generally view it as just a book. We view it as the most perfect book to ever exist, and as the book that has no mistakes. And that is a really, black and white statement to make. But we believe it to be true. Also, if I do make random noises during the voice recording, I think I have ADHD, and I'm in the process of trying to get a diagnosis because I think it may help. Anyway. So, some of my favorite verses were I found it through obviously reading the Quran multiple times, but I haven't read the whole Quran multiple times. That would be, I mean, scholar level, good for you. Uh, but I did buy recently a jar online, um, a Quranic jar, that's what they called it, and it is basically Quranic verses for every emotion that a human being can get so that they can deal with it. And here are some of my favorite verses. You. So the verse basically, the jar basically is like it says, read me when happy, thankful, angry, anxious, lonely, sad, and it's color coded. And yep, that's the first disclaimer out there. 1 second. Now, this is from MuslimKids.tv, and it is saying that in the Quran is healing for the wounded souls, peace for the troubled souls, contentment for the happy souls, and refuge for the frightened souls. Part 2 coming soon.